this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is a video to compare two fantastic low-profile flagship keyboards, the Logitech G915 and the Razer DeathStalker V2 Pro. These are two very similar keyboards with a similar price point and some interesting highlights that make them stand apart, including Razer's optical switches that you can see here on the right, and obviously Logitech's GL switch lineup as well. More on that in a bit, but what I wanted to do in this video is compare the two side by side to show you the differences and similarities between them. You'll see, for example, with this top-down view that the DeathStalker V2 Pro is ever so slightly smaller. Despite being a full-size keyboard, it has some of the functions in other areas and also doesn't have dedicated media keys, but it does have a dedicated media multi-action wheel and button. You also notice that it's a little bit fatter than the Logitech keyboard, and there's a reason for that. That's those optical switches. Now, I have reviewed the DeathStalker V2 Pro and gone into a bit more depth on that, but I want to talk to you about some of the other things. You'll see that Logitech, for example, has 5 G keys. Those are dedicated macro keys down the left-hand side, as well as onboard storage for 3 different profiles with M1, M2, and M3. The Razer keyboard, meanwhile, has 5 onboard storage profiles, and those are adjustable in Razer's Synapse software. It also has customizable keys that you can tweak within the software, including adding macros and Razer's Hypershift, so there's potentially more programmability in the DeathStalker V2 Pro than there is in the G915, which is worth bearing in mind. Now, these keyboards are interesting because they're comparable in a number of different ways. That G915, for example, has a 30-hour-ish battery life with the RGB turned all the way up, whereas the DeathStalker V2 Pro claims 40 hours with the lighting at around 50%. So similar battery, although the DeathStalker is a bit chunkier, so it should theoretically last longer, especially if you turn the lighting down. You'll notice that both of them have some pretty good RGB lighting though, and I do think they're both striking for a number of different reasons, not least of which is that aluminium backplate with the brushed finish on it that makes it look really nice. Now, I've been using the G915 TKL variant, the smaller compact version of this keyboard, for quite some time, and I've really enjoyed it. This is the GL tactile version, and I'm going to do a sound test at the end to compare the two, so stick with me for that if you want to hear the differences between the switches. But you'll see that from various angles the G915 really looks very nice and obviously has a lot of options in terms of button presses. So I've already mentioned the G keys and the memory recall buttons, but you also have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connectivity and a gaming mode which disables the Windows key and other things, as well as a brightness button. You'll notice they have a rubberized effect on them and they're quite pleasant to press in that way. Also, as you'll see, nice setup in terms of the key switches, and then you have the dedicated media playback buttons on the top right, so play, pause, skip, mute, and a satisfying volume wheel as well. I really like this setup because it gives you really easy access to be able to play and pause and skip and all tunes really easily, and that is one of the benefits of this keyboard over the DeathStalker. If you put them flat on the desk, you'll see they're both very low profile, and this is great actually for comfort reasons. This is one of the reasons I really like the G915 TKL, because it's much more comfortable thanks to that low profile fit. You'll see it here compared with a coin to give you an idea of the height. It is very low to the desk, and it is lower than the DeathStalker as well. It has a thinner profile overall, although the same sort of logic in terms of the height of the switches and the keycaps, so they're comparable. But if you put them side by side, you would see that the DeathStalker slopes upward at the back because it has a chunkier battery, and that battery is required to power it for longer because you have per key RGB, but you also have per key optical switches. So there's an optical light beam for every switch on the keyboard, which means it needs more power, so that has to be chunkier by necessary evil. So there is one thing to bear in mind. Now, this keyboard has ABS laser etched keycaps with an ultra durable coating. The idea here is to make sure that it doesn't get marred by finger oils and such over time. I did a video recently after a year of use of the G915 to show how the black keycaps unfortunately do mar. It would be interesting to see how the DeathStalker V2 Pro holds up, because again, it's a similar design. If you look at the shots, you'll see that they look quite similar. However, there are some differences. You'll notice a sound difference at the end, for example, and I have noticed some differences in other things. Now, the DeathStalker also has some hidden highlights. You'll notice the end key here, for example. If you press function and end, you get an idea of your battery life. You'll also see that it has memory for 3 Bluetooth profiles, so you can connect up 3 different Bluetooth devices, and it uses USB-C for charging purposes. And you have the option, obviously, to use Bluetooth or 2.4 gigahertz with Razer's technology there, so you give you a good solid connection. It also has a technology that scans for the best signal to give you a nice clean signal to your PC as well. So the DeathStalker V2 Pro seems like a more premium and also more feature-rich option compared to the G915. I will say I think the G915 looks nicer though, and there are some reasons why I prefer it, but there's a lot going on with the DeathStalker that's worth talking about, and it is a very nice setup. You can see on the underneath you have flippable feet, and there's also a little dock here where you can store the dongle when it's not in use. Now this dongle also has an adapter, so you can connect it up to your PC with relative ease and still have the cable within reach. And I think that's pretty important because in my experience, the battery doesn't last that long unless you turn the lighting all the way down. They say it will last for 10 days, but that's based on 4 hours of use per day, which is pretty limited, and obviously also the lighting variance. Now, the main highlight of this keyboard is not only obviously the low profile keycaps and the comfortable design, but also those switches. So these are optical switches from Razer, which are available either linear or tactile, so clicky ones, but at the moment you can only get the linear ones, and they give you a 1.2mm actuation. They're also really well designed and well stabilised, and what I found is, as you'll hear later on, through the majority of the keyboard there's very little rattle and it's really comfortable to type on. I also found there's very little wobble in the keycaps, and although the stabilisation isn't that fancy, it does deliver a really good typing experience and really good results when gaming or just day-to-day use, so it's very good in a number of different ways. Obviously this has the advantage over the Logitech switches, which are just mechanical switches, so they're not as fancy, but you do have the option of GL tactile, GL linear and GL clicky with the Logitech keyboard. However, they all actuate at 1.5mm, so not quite as fast, and they also require a little bit more force in order to actuate. I'll leave all the specs in the description so you can compare the two on paper, but my experience is that they're both wonderful to use and wonderful to type on. As I said, the G915 TKL has been my favourite for a long time. The DeathStalker is ever so slightly better, I think. The stabilisation of the keycaps a little bit nicer. There's a little bit less wobble. Minor difference between the two, but a noticeable difference still I have picked up on it. And I do really like the feel and the sound and the feedback from this keyboard and the overall design of it. Obviously also having optical switches means that it will last longer. These are guaranteed up to 70 million clicks, which is interestingly different from Razer's standard full-size optical switches, which are guaranteed up to 100. Obviously the low profile means they're not quite as good. But you can see the difference between them. They sort of use that Cherry MX crosshatch design, whereas the Logitech ones have multiple pins that go into the switch and then on the keycaps. Now, I've said when I tested out the G915 TKL that the keycaps feel a bit flimsy and those pins could easily break over time. I haven't actually experienced that problem, but I still think if you're heavy-handed and regularly removing the keycaps in order to clean it, you might accidentally break them. I don't feel the same about the Razer. I feel that I'll hold up a bit better over time. The setup there is a little bit nicer. As you can see, the RGB lighting is great on both. The Razer has nice laser etching on it, and also the lettering is designed so that all the lettering is lit up really well, both the main symbols and the secondary layer as well. So overall, both fantastic keyboards for different reasons. I think I prefer the G915 for the multi-access media buttons and maybe the overall design, but if you're looking for a full-size keyboard but yet one with a smaller profile and also a comfortable fit, then turn to the DeathStalker V2 Pro. Stick around now for the sound test and to hear what these keyboards sound like against each other. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for watching.